let's start with some explanations. The first of which is Rob texted me in a mad rush about 2 weeks ago and said, can you talk on the 6th? And I ignored him. I screened his text and intentionally didn't reply. Because the last thing I want to do is stand up here exposed in front of you and have to pretend like I've got some wisdom to share with you for 45 minutes. And Rob, being Rob, promptly, and I mean like real promptly, like I didn't reply for an hour, he called my wife and said, "Is Jeff dodging me?" She's like, "Probably." So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Dodd, and I recently was on the board here at the Gathering House. After that, I took like a little sabbatical to breathe. I haven't been around much, but that's mostly because I've been traveling for work a lot. And this is probably the only time between now and maybe July that you'll actually see me, because I'm going to be gone for another month. I work at Gonzaga. I do a variety of things there. I teach in the English department, where I teach both writing classes and African literature classes. I also run an office around faculty development, so I provide workshops to help faculty improve the quality of their instruction, how they design courses, and that sort of thing. And absolutely none of that has anything to do with what I'm going to talk about today. But I think it's useful that you get to know a little bit about what I do on the daily at GU. What I hope to talk with you about today is this concept of accompaniment that you saw in the video that Grant put together. Grant's a student who went to Zambezi, Zambia last summer, and I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about the experiences that our students have on that particular study abroad trip. I have gone there most every summer for the past 5 years, and I'll be leaving next week to go again for another month with 20 students. And so Rob said, when I asked for clarification finally, right, when he cornered me and I couldn't get out of it, because what he said is, well, you could do it on the 13th too. If the 6th doesn't work, right? I'm like, Mother's Day, right? Sorry, not going to happen. The turnip truck I fell off of didn't drive by yesterday, right? So I knew better than to schedule it for Mother's Day. So here we are. He said, we just finished up this series on Acts, right? I've been preaching through Acts for like the last 5 years. And so what I'm hoping for is that you and Margot, who will be talking next week, would give us a sense for what it might look like to live out some of the missional aspects that we saw in the book of Acts, in our study of the book of Acts. And he said, I know that what you do in Zambia isn't traditional mission work, but I'd like to see if you can share some about what you do and what makes it distinctive, and how you think it is a part of God's calling for your life and your work, right? And so as I start thinking about that, I think that really what it boils down to is this practice of accompaniment, and that's a term that many of you won't be familiar with, and so I'm going to spend a little bit of time unpacking that at the outset. Emma and Kai and I did not rehearse this at all, so I'm going to give them like awkward signals to advance the slides. I'm a college professor, so I've always got a PowerPoint in my back pocket. So we are now going to advance the slide. If you are not near one of these monitors, I apologize. If you are near one of these monitors, hopefully you'll be able to see some of the fine detail. This is the continent of Africa, right? It is not a country, but instead it's 54 modern nation states that comprise our contemporary manifestation of what used to be about 2,000 ethno-linguistic groups around the continent, right? We're looking at 16% of the human population that lives on this continent, right? And so roughly 1 out of 7 human beings in the world today live in some part of this continent. There are about 1,000 active language groups still being spoken on this continent, and there are about 6 colonial languages that are widely spoken. And so that includes Arabic, English, a version of Dutch, French, and Portuguese. Right? And so I think that's important to know because we tend, right, and I think it's natural when you're not living in or get to travel to a place, we tend to essentialize a lot, right? And we think about Africa as that place over there that we know is full of conflict, it's got some other attributes, right? You go there to go on safari, but it is a very complex place comprised of many, many different individual people group and cultures. And that's important because the contemporary church is growing not in places like Spokane, right? But the contemporary Christian church is growing in places like the African continent, right? And so I think it's important that we continue to educate ourselves about what that world beyond our own borders looks like. So if we could go, one thing that I would like to mention, there's a note here that says 1/3 or more of the world's supply of cobalt. That's actually a typo. It should say 2/3 or more. 63% of cobalt in the world is mined in a little area. This is going to be the moment where I just fall off the stage. You can't see this map very well, but an area right here in eastern Congo and Rwanda. Now, we'll talk about why that's important in a minute, but each one of you who's walking around with a cell phone is walking around with a little bit of cobalt in your pocket, right? And we'll discuss that further. So Emma or Kai. Zambia, if you can see the inset map up there, is in South Central Africa. It's just south of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's just north of Zimbabwe. Where we go, the capital of Lusaka is that large red dot down in the central area of the country. And then we get on these tiny little planes, one of which could easily fit on this stage. And we fly for another 3 hours from a missionary flying service that gets us into Zambezi. Zambezi is a town of about 10,000 to 15,000 people in the metropolitan area, mostly subsistence farmers. It is right along the Zambezi River, which is the 4th largest river on the continent, and ultimately flows out into the Indian Ocean when it finally ends. Right, so it's sort of this kidney bean-shaped country. It's entirely landlocked. It's got 9 other countries, borders with 9 other countries, rather. And it is also home to Victoria Falls. So if you've ever seen a majestic photo of a very large waterfall in Africa, there's only 2 options, and this is the one that it probably is. Right? You saw a picture of it, actually, at the end of that video where it panned across this wide drop cascade. That's Victoria Falls. All right, if we go to the next slide, I present these images not because I want to talk about them individually, but because I think they're representative of some of the things we think about when we think about Africa, right? We think about smiling people who dance a lot and have a lot of joy, right? Which is true. I didn't put the child soldier picture here, right? That's the other one. That's the dark side of the continent that we don't want to think about. And we certainly don't want to think about our own complicity in that, right? There are, in fact, smiling, dancing, happy people on the continent of Africa. There are elephants, and they will charge you. I can tell you that from personal experience. There are geographic wonders, right? And so that's the gorge that Victoria Falls cuts underneath a bridge that was built in 1905 and is still operational. And then there are lots of orphans, right? So this little boy I met 3 years ago, he sat in my lap for about, 2.5 hours. About 10 minutes into that, he peed with no diaper on. That was fun. And at first warm. Right? But this is an orphanage that we visit, and our students learn about what it is to care for members of a community. Right? So all of this and many other images that we have about the continent are in some measure true. Right? There are the child soldiers. There are the corrupt leaders. Right? There is intense poverty. Right? There are joyful people overcoming great odds, right? But those things are, of course, only part of a story, right? And so I want to expand that story a little bit. If we move forward, I've got like some facts and figures about the country of Zambia, and I'm just going to run through them. I don't actually care if you remember any of these, so if you're taking notes, you can stop. Zambia was in really the second wave of countries to gain independence. So in 1957, Ghana was the first African country to gain independence in West Africa. Zambia came along in 1964. It has, and it is one of the only countries on the continent that can say this, it has an uninterrupted peaceful transfer of power. Right? There has never been an armed conflict about the leadership of the country. It's been election and peaceful handover ever since 1964, right? Which is remarkable given a lot of the struggles that they face. In size, it's slightly larger than the state of Texas. It has a population of 16 million people, and about 40% of them live in the urban areas. The median age is 16.8, right? To give you a point of comparison, the median age for the United States is 38 years old, right? So there's an entire generation of Zambians who died largely as a result of the HIV crisis, right? And so it's an extraordinarily youthful country, which has its ups and its downs, right? The positive is there is a kind of optimism about the future, right? We have a group of young people on whom we can peg our hopes, right? The downside is they don't have a whole lot of people to learn from, right? Parents and grandparents did not live long enough to actually teach and care for these kids. Okay, so in terms of industries, copper mining, subsistence agriculture, tourism in certain parts, and then hydroelectric power, right? Hydroelectric power because that main river flows right through the nation. Life expectancy, 52.7 years, right? A little higher for women, a little lower for men. US, 80, to give you another point of comparison. The per capita GDP, which is just one way to measure the value of a person's labor, is $4,000 per year, right? Your point of comparison here is in Washington State, that per capita GDP is $50,000, right? So think about if you had to live in Washington State on $4,000 a year. 61% of the country lives below Zambia's defined poverty line, right? Here, we average about 14%, roughly. HIV prevalence is 12.8%, right? Now, they have access now to all kinds of antiretroviral drugs. This number is not going up. It's in fact going down significantly in recent years, but it is still a major issue, a major healthcare issue for the country. And again, a point of comparison, HIV prevalence in the United States is less than 1%, right? Now, a lot of people, and I've had these conversations with missionaries in Zambia, and I've had these conversations with Christians in the U.S., and they say, well, if only they had the gospel. Right? If only they knew Jesus to help them solve their problems. And then I tell them 96% of Zambians are Christians. And about 112% of them could teach any one of us a few things about faith, resilience, and perseverance, and dependence on the gospel. Right? Literacy rates, 61.4%. Right? So the population is relatively literate, though not anywhere near a kind of developed country standard. Right? So this is one way, thinking about the stats, right? Thinking about the kinds of demographic markers that we tend to lean on and we tend to use as ways to tell the stories about the people we don't actually know. Right? Another way is to try to go know them. Right? So that's what we do with this program, Gonzaga and Zambezi. And if we go to the next slide, it's like just the slimmest overview of this program. We go for a month. Students get 6 credit hours. There we go. They focus largely on intercultural leadership, and in that, the premise of the program is that we want our students to develop a deep understanding of culturally aware leadership, a greater sense of self-awareness, right? How a student's function, role, aptitudes as a leader affect the decisions they make and how they work with other people, and an intentional practice of accompaniment, right? And what we mean by that intentional practice of accompaniment in our context is listening intently, right? Not just performing listening, right? When we meet strangers, we often perform deep and meaningful listening, right? We might hold their handshake a little longer than we normally would, right? And when they say something, oh yeah, me too, right? And then when they say something we don't quite understand, we try to tell our own story back to them, right? In a way that tries to get some affirmation or confirmation that we understand what's going on with them. Right? But we coach our students to actually shut up, right? We tell them from the outset, the moment they get accepted into the program, you are not likely to change anyone's life if you go into this program thinking you're going to change somebody's life. Right? You are not going to solve the problems of a nation of 16 million people in 1 month on the ground. What you can do, though, is listen to the daily experiences that they have. You can deeply perceive the challenges that they face, right? And grow in your capacity to share that story. Another thing that you can do beyond listening is nurture an ability to dream greater dreams, right? And help the people you interact nurture that ability. Right, so one of the things we do, and you can see it down here, is we do this leadership and business class where we help community members in Zambezi develop business proposals. And I would say 60% of the members of the Zambezi community come to us to take this class, and they want to develop a proposal so that they can start a shop. Right? And it makes perfect sense, because the only going economic concern in Zambezi is the local market, which is an area that's about maybe 10 square acres and has probably 85 to 100 individual shops, all of which sell roughly the same items. Right? But those are the people in the community who are doing quite well. And so people come to our class and say, I want a piece of that pie. So I'm going to start my own shop and I'll sell the same things that everybody else sells. Right? And so one of the things we do is we listen, we affirm, yeah, we understand why you would want to do that. Right? But if you do it, could you think about diversifying what you're going to offer? Right? Could you think about maybe filling a particular niche or gap that you don't see satisfied in that market? Right? So we coach our students around accompaniment to listen intently, nurture the capacity to dream bigger dreams, and a commitment to the growth of people. Right? The one thing you can do in your month in Zambia, right, and substitute in here any interaction that you have with people who are different from you. Right? If you're young, right, substitute in here your interactions with senior citizens. If you're older, right, substitute in here your interactions with those kids these days. Right? That commitment to the growth of people is fundamental. Right? And it's what all of this is built upon. Because if you don't love the strangers in your midst enough to want to see them grow, then you probably shouldn't be in their midst. You should probably have a strong look in the mirror, actually. If we go, you'll see the community development opportunities that we do now, and these are all in consultation with the community. So this program's been running for 12 years, and over the course of those years, we've sat down each year to assess our programs. And members of the community have said, we need business leadership courses, we need computer literacy courses, we want you to help our students in the schools, and we need to learn more about healthcare. Right? And even though we don't actually get a whole lot out of going and teaching somebody how to use Microsoft Word, right? It is the most popular class that we have. Right? In a space that's roughly from Phil in Asia to Bill Davis, right? We cram 75 people around 20 computers, and they come every single day for 3 hours to learn how to format bullet points in Microsoft Word. Right? Which is mind-boggling, because it's the kind of thing that many of us take for granted. Right? But it's something they said they need. It's something that drives our students crazy. They hate teaching those classes. Right? Please click here, drag your cursor till it's highlighted. Right? It is not the most stimulating teaching in the world until you actually meet somebody. And they say, oh no, if I get this certificate, I can get a job as a clerk. Right? And maybe I can get beyond that 4,000 GDP, maybe up to 4,200. Maybe I can put enough money aside to send my cousin to school. Right? And that's when the switch flips a lot of times for our students. Right? I don't really want to teach you about diarrhea and dysentery. Right? And then you ask me the question about why my child cannot get well. I say, well, what's your water supply like? Right? And those moments of basic interaction around the topic, right? Bridge, right? That metaphorical bridge that Grant talked about with the Suzuki, that's what happens in these classes, right? It's together with the community members as we get to know them. We're building those bridges. So Emma, if you'll switch to the next one. Just a little bit of weird formatting that's happening there. So over on the left-hand side, there are these 5 values. And you can see right at the bottom, capacities should be at the top. There's a kind of 2-column correspondence that I'll talk through a bit here. Rob always does this thing where he says, today we're going to look at Acts chapter 12. Right? And before you know it, he's got you going to like Hosea and Revelation and 2 Samuel, right? And you're doing this sort of whirlwind around the Bible. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to point to a few passages and we can talk through them briefly. But I will actually probably forget to read them. Right? And I mention that because each of these values is built around a set of principles rooted in Scripture. Right? So mutuality. Does anybody remember what happens in Luke 24? This is your test, right? Yes, sir. What's unique about the road to Emmaus? That story. What's happening there? If you've got the blue and white Bible, it's pages 722. See, I did prepare some. They're talking to Jesus and they don't know it. Right? He comes in their midst and they're like, have you heard? And Jesus is like, yeah, man, I heard. I'm familiar. Right? Mutuality is built upon the giving and receiving of trust as we grow together. Right? They're walking that road together. And as they do, Jesus is willing to challenge them and reveal himself. Right? And so one of these values of accompaniment is in fact that practice of mutuality that's modeled by Christ on the road to Emmaus. Right? He didn't step right out and say, Shazam, I'm the risen Lord. Right? He has to get to know them for a bit. And they have to get to know him. And only then is there enough tension, right? Enough movement in their relationship for him to be able to say, no, it's me. The second of these values, vulnerability. And there are tons and tons of passages that we might look at. But the ones that come to mind for me are things like the Canaanite woman. Right? Does anybody remember the Canaanite woman from Matthew 15? Would be dog and bread, which seems appropriate since we've got like tons and tons of bread sitting over there. Page 669 in your blue and white Bibles. She said she's not worthy to eat scraps. But they should at least be offered. Right? And he's testing her. Is it right that we throw these scraps that should be given to the children to the dogs? Right? And she pushes back a little bit. She's like, yeah. Right? I'm a person too. And he says in that passage, right, I was sent to save the lost. Right? And so this value of vulnerability, we see it again in the healing of the blind man, right? I don't know if you remember that, but Jesus heals the blind man, and he says, "What do you see?" And the blind man says, "I see men walking like trees." Right? Which is another way of saying, "You almost got it, Lord." Right? So close. Right? And he finishes the job, right? And the man's completely clear-sighted. These moments of need and vulnerability, right? The willingness to say, "Aren't I a man too?" Right? To use a more contemporary allusion from the civil rights movement. Right? But Christ knows, just as each one of us ought to know, right, that vulnerability is the driving force in opening ourselves up to relationship. Right? Now, we all know intellectually that that's true in our relationship with Christ. If we weren't vulnerable, if we weren't in some need, there would be no purpose in Christ's mission on earth. Right? He would not have had to die if we weren't in some way vulnerable. He would not have had to have been resurrected if we didn't have need. Right? But we forget that when we're talking about other people. I don't want to actually have to interact with those vulnerable people. Right? I want to be around people who have it together. People who might contribute to my comfort and well-being. Right? And I'm as guilty as anybody else with this. I don't want to get into the emotional mess of other people's lives. Inclusivity, right? And I'm not talking here like some kind of pop culture tolerance sort of thing, right? I'm talking like Naaman being healed of leprosy. Right? I'm talking about looking around at our communities and the greater kingdom and thinking not how we make everybody comfortable and welcome, right? But instead looking and wondering who's actively excluded, right? Who doesn't have a seat at the table? Right? I don't know how many of you have actually been to, anybody been to a leper colony? One. Where was it? Romania. In Romania, okay. There are still many leper colonies, and some of them still quite active. Was the one you were at active, or was it had it been shut down? Right? And they look, they take a lot of different forms, as most clinical operations do. The ones that I've been to are very small huts, right? In a row, in isolation from the main clinic. I don't know if that corresponds in any way to what you saw. Right? And when I say a small hut, I mean a living space for an individual that might be 6 by 8 feet. Right? No lights, certainly no modern amenities that we might be familiar with. Right? And the victims of leprosy would spend their entire life in care in one of those huts. Right? But that's not actually the care that we see demonstrated in Scripture. Right? It does happen to be relatively easy for us. Right? It does happen to be relatively convenient, right, to our general desire to be clean and not have to be infected by other people's business. Right? But it's not actually the vision of care and accompaniment that Scripture presents for us. Right? Now, in 2 Kings, in that story of Naaman, we get a healing. Right? And we get, I think it's one of the funniest passages in the Bible, only because Naaman's in the process of being healed. Anybody remember his response? If you don't, that's fine. Like, this is...
Why do I have to wash in this dirty water?
Okay, he's upset, right? Because it doesn't come with all the bells and whistles and the marquee and the... Right? It's like a really mundane kind of healing. Well, that's not how, that's not how it should happen. There should be some fireworks here. Right? Not the sort of day-to-day basic care, right? The touch of another human being that actually takes place in that story. The fourth value, empowerment. right? You only have to think about the tellings of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus says, do it, right? And he empowers them with the Spirit and the gifts to actually make it happen, right? And they step into that power. And then finally, sustainability. That this work takes shape over time, right? If relationships built on mutuality are going to yield any fruit, it's got to be about the process and the relationship, not about the end product, right? So this may seem a little counterintuitive, but think about Jonah. When he's told to go to Nineveh, what's that response?
No.
I'm sorry, I know we're in church and all, but not no. Hell no, I prefer to go to Tarshish. Right? Now, if you get to the end of the book of Jonah, he's told go to Nineveh. And what happens? He goes gladly, willingly, with a message. Right? But it's important to remember there's a gap there. Right? And that we have a model of sustainability. I'm going to invest in this relationship knowing full well it is not always going to work out the way I expect or hope. Right? There are going to be bumps along the way. Right? I don't know what your belly of the well is, right? But I think God knows that when he's presenting these opportunities for true accompaniment in our relationships with one another, right, that there's going to be a belly of the well moment in most of them. Right? There's going to be a moment where we actually have to contend with what's happening in our lives and what God is asking us to do. Right? Now, on the other column, and roughly in line with each of these, is a capacity that I think each of the values is asking us to cultivate. Right? So when we think about mutuality, when we think about this idea that we grow together, hospitality is fundamental to it. Right? And I don't mean just having a dinner party and making sure that you invite Bill Davis, even though you know. Right? It's hosting the dinner party and making sure that everybody there gets to be themselves. Right? We have this approach to education at Gonzaga, right? Everybody gets to have their own front door. Right? We all get to have our own starting point. Right? And mutuality is fundamentally dependent upon that. And hospitality, when it's done well, remembers that. Vulnerability maps nicely with empathy. Right? That we can move from pity to compassion, from compassion to empathy, and from empathy to radical solidarity with our brothers and sisters. Right? That's going to take time. We're going to have to walk together as we get there. Right? But they're related. And if we didn't have vulnerability, just as Christ wouldn't have had to die for us, right, then we wouldn't need to practice empathy. Across from inclusivity, it says asset-based thinking, right, which is a more technical kind of term than any of the rest of these. Right, but it simply points to the reality that if we are going to have a seat at the table for the Naamans of the world, right, we have to remember that they have something to offer. Right, this is one of the reasons we do the sack lunches. This is one of the reasons we do most of the ministry we do here. Right? Because no matter who it is we are entering into relationship with, they've got something that they're going to be able to contribute. They've got a gift, right? They haven't gone through Rob's Discerning Your Gifts class, right? But they've got something, right? Even if it is their fundamental dignity as a human. Empowerment maps along with systems-based thinking. Right? If we're gonna take as a value the idea that we can empower others to have some agency and voice in their own lives, right? We also need to be thinking about the systems in place that diminish that voice. The systems in place that make it a challenge for them to act on that agency. Right? In the U.S., that might be something like a significant wealth gap. Right? That means the poorest in our society will almost assuredly never have access to the same luxuries and privileges that the richest in our society do, right? This is where I play the guilt card a little bit. I mentioned that 2/3 of the world's cobalt come from DR Congo and Rwanda, right? Systems-based thinking forces us to remember, right, that when we might want to lament all the civil wars and the child soldiers, right, the poverty and the destruction, the depravity that we see in some regions of Africa, we also have to remember that the $800 we shell out on our iPhone contributes to that, right? Or maybe you're not iPhone. Maybe you're still flip phone. It's still got a battery, right? So the choices we make here, that seem relatively innocuous, right? Am I going to go to Samsung or am I going to go Google, right? Those have a direct impact on the competition for resources in this place 25,000 miles away from you, right? And the daily lived experience of children who are diving into these open pit mines, trying to harvest toxic chemicals. Right? And then finally, for sustainability, the only honest way to map that across, because it's hard, you all know this. If you've ever walked alongside somebody who's just a total train wreck, right? I mean, it's probably yourself, but still. Right? If you've ever really committed yourself to the growth and the flourishing of somebody who's facing profound struggles, you know the only way you're going to get through that is prayer and worship. Right? So when we talk about sustainability, right, the capacity that invites us to cultivate, right, is the constant petitioning of the Lord. Right? Help me through this. Give me the patience not to kick that person in, you know what. Right? Give me the patience to actually show up the next time they call. Or to not show up, if that needs to be the wiser choice. Right? Okay. So I've preached at you long enough. Emma, you're on. Okay. So you know the doofus on the right. The guy on the left, Michael Sapalinia, I met him about 5 years ago when he was in what is sort of parallel to our 8th grade. He was what's called the head boy at his school. This is a rural school about 600 miles from the nearest city in northwestern Zambia. The head boy is a term that is given to the highest achieving academic students in the school, right? And that's Michael. Michael just graduated high school, right? It's not called high school there, but he just graduated high school as what would be sort of parallel to our valedictorian at a boarding school there, right? So I met Michael when he was just about to finish middle school, and he said, "Sir," he actually sounds like that. I'm just putting on an accent. "Sir, do you have any books for me? I heard you're a literature teacher. Do you have any books for me?" Right? Now, the only book I had with me was this Zambian novel that I had picked up in the bookstore in the capital before we got on our little flight. And so I gave it over to him, and he comes back 2 days later and he says, "It's too hard. I can't read this." Right? Now, this is a book, mind you, called Cowrie of Hope by a Zambian author, written roughly for a middle school age audience, about a young woman who traveled from a rural area, much like Zambezi, to the capital city of Lusaka. Right? If there were a book in the world that were going to be more accessible for Michael, given his conditions, I can't imagine it. Right? It spoke directly to the economic conditions he faced, what he observed in his community, right? But the writing level was just too much for him, or at least he perceived it was too much for him. Right? So I come back the next year, and I'm like, Michael, here are some books that are better for you. And he said, Sir, if I'm going to have all these books, I need a bag. Can I have a backpack? Right? And so over the years, Michael and I have developed this relationship. When I go this time, I'm going to be bringing him a laptop. Because, right, and this is the weird psychology of it all. I'm bringing him a laptop with a lithium-ion battery. Right? No way around it. Because Michael got accepted to the University of Zambia, right, which is the most prestigious national university in the country. And his fees are entirely paid for if he can get the supplies that will allow him to thrive, right? And a laptop now is one of those necessary supplies, right? So when we talk about sustainability or longevity, when we talk about allowing students or people within whom we're in community to dream a bigger dream, right? This back and forth over time with Michael is one of those success stories. Right? Especially when we think about a country with a median age of 16.8, right? It's kids like Michael, I hope one day, will end up being the future of this country. Now, Michael actually wants to be an airline pilot, so he can get the heck out of Zambia. But, you know, who am I to judge? Still a great kid, lots of potential, and as we all know, right, the dream you have when you're 18, right? Okay, let's meet Josephine. Josephine is not 18. Josephine is very cagey, and she will not tell you how old she is. But I know for a fact that she was a teenager in 1964. Because Josephine Labako, as a teenager in the early 60s, was an underground revolutionary agent. Right? Now, what that means is that as a teenager, when she was in primary and middle school, what she and the other girls in her class would do is they would wander around and they would pay attention to where the British military forces were positioned. And they would pay attention to how they moved and where they repositioned their soldiers and the decisions they made at what's called the district council. And then she would report those back to the actual revolutionary guerrilla fighters. Right? So she was doing the spy game work as a 12, 13, 14-year-old, 15-year-old girl in the early 60s. Right? She remained politically active after independence. The first president of the country, Kenneth Kaunda, respected her so much, he called her that iron girl of the Northwest. Right? Because she was unwavering in her commitment to independence, right? And she knew that empowerment of the people, and especially empowerment of the girls and women in this country, were going to be fundamental to the future success of Zambia. Now Josephine is the regional director of an organization called SEPA, which is, broadly speaking, an educational organization that serves rural Zambian women. She remained politically active even through her marriage, and ultimately in the late 80s left her husband because he said, you can't be politically active anymore. And she said, you want to bet? Right? Now this is the kind of fundamental commitment that she has to a thriving Zambia. Right? That we have to have people engaged in the politics of the day, and that we can't just leave that work to the people who are already in power, right? And that has to take the shape of a broad-based educational movement. And so still, 54 years after independence, right, somewhere between her late 60s to mid-70s, right, she is still just as active in these movements. Right? So when we think about those values, she's spending time in the community, right? She's walking alongside members of towns like Kalandola and Zambezi and Kabumpo. Right? She is looking for who's actively excluded. She is thinking about the systems of exclusion that contribute to that. Right? And in her own little way, the Iron Girl of the Northwest continues, even in her older years, right? Well beyond the general life expectancy of a Zambian woman to follow God's call in making that country thrive. She's an inspiring person, right? The next example is maybe more problematic. Alube Kapalo is somebody I met. These photographs are kind of a struggle. I'm always interested in how things are made and why, right? Like, what kind of crazy genius decides, I'm going to take a plastic jar, right? This is what honey comes in and some kinds of cooking oil. And I'm going to scratch this on it. Right? So I find a bunch of these around Zambezi one year, the second year that I went. And I'm like, I have got to find the mad genius who's doing this. Right? I don't have any idea. I don't know anything about the backstory. I don't know what's going on. But there's this rudimentary local art form that I want to know more about. And so I tracked down this character, Alube Kapalo. And Alube Kapalo lives outside of Zambezi. The middle part is his hut. And the inscription on the side of his hut, it says, "One world, many differences." And underneath that, it says, "Corner view." And then there are 3 scripture references. On every side of his house, he has carved or painted scripture references, right? Inside his house, that's what this first photo is he has wired his mud hut, right? And it really is a mud hut. It's like straw, caked with mud, dried in the sun. He has wired it with those little canister lanterns, right? The cheap kind that you can get at the general store. He's wired them up to switches to run on D-cell batteries. So this guy is lighting his entire house on 4 D-cell batteries, which are flooded into Zambia from the Chinese market, right? They're dirt cheap. They're frankly an environmental atrocity because there's no safe way to dispose of them, right? But for him, that's a capital upgrade. I can get power, but even though we don't have a national power grid that I can access, right? So he's been able to light his home. Now, over on the right-hand side, you'll see a photo at one of the regional hospitals. That is his wife, Betty, standing up. That is their daughter, Rachel, standing on the right-hand side. And their son, Ephraim, is lying down, if you can see it. Ephraim has a profound case of spina bifida, several other developmental disabilities. He's about 16 months in this photograph. And without some pretty significant life-saving intervention, he's not going to see 2 years old, right? So I went thinking, I want to find the kook who does this, right? And what I found is Alube Kapalo and his family, right, ripe with inventiveness and innovation and a passion for seeing their community improve, and also carrying this burden of how to care for this kid. Right? Now, it is a very easy lift for someone in my position to be able to cobble together the money to get Ephraim to the capital and to try to get the care that he needs. Right? $1,500 is not the kind of money that falls out of the tree in my front yard, right? But it is also not, in the grand scheme of things, something that I couldn't find a way to get it, right? Unfortunately, by the time I'm able to get him, Ephraim has already died. I can only go to Zambezi once a year, and there's no effective way to communicate with most people in a place like Zambezi in that intermediate period. So when I show up the next year, I find their entire compound in disrepair. Alube has been arrested because he got drunk and tried to kill someone one night. Betty and Rachel decided that instead of staying there on their own, they would go back to her ancestral home about 200 kilometers away near Angola. Right? So this is one of those things where sustainability and prayer and worship becomes the only redoubt. It's the only fallback. Right? Because all I can do is pray for Alube and his family. And hope that when I go back there in 3 weeks, I find a different kind of reality. Right? Knowing full well that that's not very likely, at least in my own wisdom. Right? God's wisdom is different. And I know that the work that Alube did before this catastrophe hit his family, right, has had an effect on me and my students in ways that I can continue to share with other people. The next example is Katindi Kawatu. She's been a part of our work there for a decade. She first started actually as a house servant. We hired her to do cooking for our American students. Now, if you spend much time on continental Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, you know that the cuisine maybe won't feel comfortable to a lot of young Americans. Right? So in Zambia, there's something called shima. If you've been to other parts of Africa, you might know it as gari or fufu. It is a cornmeal paste, right, that you tear off a ball, you wad it up, and you use that as your utensil. And then what goes along with it is some kind of stewed greens, maybe some really, really overcooked chicken, maybe some dried fish that's been reconstituted and fried, right? Lots of different ways that this cuisine is prepared. But Katindi came to cook for us and to introduce our students to all the delights of Zambian cooking. So that was a decade ago. This is her last year. Now it's the year before. She knew no English when she started working with us. Right? She spoke the local language of Lunda. This is her translating from Lunda to English and back for our students as they teach a lesson on business leadership. Right? So in 10 years, walking alongside us, helping us serving her, she's learned English. Right? She has lost a marriage. She's had 7 kids. After that 7th kid, her husband abandoned her because she was no longer young enough. She was no longer pretty enough. Right? Her body had served its purpose in his estimation, and he moved on. Right? So then, as a 38-year-old woman, she's got 7 kids. As a 39-year-old woman, her sister died giving birth to twins. So now she has 9 kids. Right? So one of the things that we do with Katindi is we pay her a living wage to work with us, to teach our students. Right? We have taught her how to put together business proposals, how to teach classes. She goes back to the town she lives in when we're not there, and she teaches knitting classes. She teaches other people English for small fees. Right? And she cares for those 9 kids as best she can, right? By leveraging both the skills and experiences that we've offered, as well as the broader network of connections that she's been able to cultivate as a result. Right? And so when I mentioned that those values include empowerment, and they include sustainability, and they privilege things like mutuality and vulnerability, right? When you have a 39-year-old woman break down while she's on the phone because she's just heard that her sister has died, right? All of those things are front and center in that moment. And many of you have had moments like that, unfortunately, right? We just happen to experience them on the other side of the world with a lot of people who speak another language, right? But Katindi is an example for us. She is persona non grata in the community where we go because her husband still attends the Catholic Church that hosts our trip. And even though he's the one who left, she's the one who spurned. Right? And so part of that relationship, when I said earlier that sometimes you got to push back, sometimes you got to think about dreaming a bigger dream beyond what's right in front of you. Part of what we have to do is say to the priest of that church, I don't care about your custom in this particular instance. Right? Mr. Kawatu, who abandoned this woman, has shown himself not to be a person, right, on whom we're going to peg decisions like this. However, contending has shown steadfastness, love, perseverance, a commitment to her family, and a commitment to your community, right? And she's coming back to work with us, right? So there's a kind of advocacy that happens there that points right toward an empowerment in the community. And by that example, we hope that then she will manifest that kind of empowerment and those kind of values within her community moving forward. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little more broadly. Right, I promise I'm wrapping up. So this is my student Lindsay, who is now doing Teach for America down in Sunnyside in Central Washington. And what's in her hand is a piece of a honeycomb. Right? Zambia Gold Honey is a project that was started about 9 years ago, and we sell the product of a bunch of beekeepers in the Northwest province. We sell it here in the U.S., and I'll talk a little more about that, but I want to give you a taste for how this honey is harvested, because it looks cute when it's in this jar, right? But there's a lot more that goes into it. Remember, are we going to be able to get that video? Okay, so the guy in blue that put on the mask and climbed the tree, his name's James. James is one of the beekeepers whose product ends up in these jars. What you saw him doing was he gets a bundle of grass, grass leaves, it's got to be green. He lights it, he climbs up in the tree, and he uses that to smoke the bees out of the hive, right? Now, the hives in Zambia are not in those little white canisters that we're all used to seeing. They're actually in hollowed out chunks of bark. So they take the bark of the tree, reshape it into what looks like a log, plug the ends, and put a starter comb in there. And the bees, over this series of months, will actually fill that up with honeycomb. And then he climbs up and harvests it, and then it goes off to be processed, right? And so what the students there are eating is the fresh comb. So this honey, like I said, over the last 9 years, has been sold around the world, but mostly in the U.S. Right? And when we talk about accompaniment, one of the things that I mentioned earlier on was listening intently. Right? It would be very easy for us to think about community development and to go into Zambezi and say, we see these 12 problems, really obvious. Right? But what we have to do instead is work with the community members to identify what they perceive to be the systems-based challenges that they face. And almost always, the answer to that question about what challenges do you face has something to do with education, right? And so when we started this project, we worked with the local school, and they said, what we want is a library. There are no libraries here. And they don't mean there aren't any libraries like at our school. There isn't a library in the entire district. There's one library in the entire province. Right? So imagine, right, I could be cheeky and name some states where I'm suspicious there might not be any libraries. I grew up in the South. Right? But imagine an entire state that didn't have a library, or that only had one. Right? So, in consultation with that school, they said, we want to build a library. And we're like, uh-oh. So, we sold honey and built a library. Right? So, this is the only library in the district. It is now the largest library in the province. You don't get the full thing, but it's roughly about the size of this space. All right? It's got 20,000 books that were all funded and paid for by little jars of honey, right? One at a time. What I love about this project, though, is that it was initiated by the community members, right? It was a process of listening. What are your needs? How can we walk alongside you? How can we empower you to achieve that goal, right? One thing we have access to is people with disposable income, right? People who, for whatever reason, want a jar of Zambian honey. What they have access to is a vision, a desire, and the wherewithal to see it come true, right? So our students, having gone there for the last 12 years, did not place a single brick in this library. We didn't install any of those windows. We didn't put a single screw in the sheet metal in the roof, right? We didn't build a shelf. That work was all done by Zambians in pursuit of this goal, right? What we did was share stories about their community, right? And about the way in which this honey is harvested. And the goal that we have of helping them step into what we think God would have by way of community development in Zambia. Okay? And I think I'm going to close with a reference to... Excuse me. I'm not a pro with one of these, so I'm glad I didn't just cough it. Right? The story of the Good Samaritan. Right? We've all heard, or at least most of us have heard, the story of the Good Samaritan. Right? And we know that it's a model. Right? But I want to remind you of the words 1 year before he was assassinated, when Martin Luther King Jr. preached on that passage from Luke. Right? He said, on the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. He reminds us that that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Right? And I think that that's what we're all called to if we're responding to the models that are presented in the Acts of the Apostle. Right? There is an edifice that produces beggars. And that we have an opportunity to contribute to the restructuring of that edifice. Right? For me, in part, it's these trips to Zambia. Right? That is not going to be true for the vast majority of you. Right? It is primarily super expensive to get there. Right? But more importantly, that edifice is in place in our community. Right? And each one of us has relationships that allow us an opportunity to begin the restructuring. Right? As we grow side by each with others, as we make sure that we're attentive to who's not being included in a conversation, as we admit our weaknesses, as we step out and try to empower others to address their needs, come alongside them when they can't. And when in prayerful worship, we stay for the long haul. Right? That we don't disappear on them. And that we extend Christ's love just as He extends it to us each day. I will not see you for at least 6 weeks. So thanks for listening to me for, I'm sure, what felt like an inordinately long time. I appreciate your perseverance and steadfastness. If you have questions about any of this, I'm happy to talk more about it. As you can imagine, I could go, I could pull a Bill Davis here. Go on and on. But instead, I will leave you with a small challenge, right? And that is simply that you identify one small moment, one one small relationship where you might be able to practice these principles, these values of accompaniment over the next 6 weeks. And I'll check in with you when I get back.